If people come later, we will make room for them, okay? Oh, I'm looking around at everybody. It's so nice to see familiar faces, some new faces. On aging, what does that say about us? Is this like an appropriate topic
what's
here?
The median age here?
This will be apropos for everybody. Welcome. I wanted to welcome you to the Institute and just to give you a little introduction about what we do here for people who are not familiar with us. Also want to introduce our director, Tom Thacker, who's right here, and Judy is running around doing everything. I call her the administrator of everything. She takes care of all the business things here.
She's in charge of it.
Yeah. But we are a teaching and training institute, and we, wait till he gets off the phone.
No, I'm bringing Ian into the class.
Okay, put him on.
Hey Ian, we got you.
Hi, one more.
Oh, hi.
Is there another chair in the office? All right. Oh, there's one back there. What, Leslie? Yeah. Okay. KPI is a teaching and training institute. We do train psychoanalysts. It's a rigorous program to go through, but we also provide a wealth of other classes, courses, workshops, and we're actually looking for your input today because we wanted to diversify more. So if you have any ideas about topics that you want, the types of workshops, the courses that we offer are really 10-week workshops, which can be time-consuming, but if you have an interest in an area where we could do a one-time deal, a three-time deal, we're happy to hear from you. We had a lot of ideas, but we really want to get some input from everybody else. We also now have computer, internet connections. I don't know what else to call it. We are videotaping this workshop, so it will be available for people who are not here. There actually is someone who couldn't make it today who wanted to take the class, so they are always available on video. So if you want to see it again, it's available. We have Google Hangout. I always say hang up. It's Google Hangout, which means that we can have a video conference. If you can't make it to the class, we can hook you up with your computer. You can interact with us. If you can't make it at that time, you can also see the class afterwards. So that's all the stuff, okay?
You might want to mention our one-year psychoanalytic psychotherapy attendance program.
We have a 1 year, I thought it was 2 years.
It's
2 years. For people who are interested in taking courses and want to get a certificate and not go through the complete certification for a registered certified psychoanalyst, that is also available. Okay? Okay, I have my great outline here. Actually, I'm going to do this first. I'm changing my outline. I want everybody to take a card. Let me pass these around. And I am also going to hand out the outlines for today. Everybody gets a packet of material. Here's, pass it around here. Pass it around here. Let me wait till everybody has one. Does anyone need a pen? Anyone without a pen? Okay. I have more. Does everybody have one?
More outlines.
More outlines.
Does everybody have an index card and an outline? We have. Did you pass this down? Index card? Outline? Everybody good? Okay. On the front of the index card, and these are just for you, really. I mean, we may collect them afterwards, but they can be anonymous. On the front of the index card, if you could write down what brought you here today. What was the motivation to come? And on the back of the index card, if you would indicate a topic that you really hope is discussed today. Those two things. Take a minute. topic that you would hope would be discussed today? A topic that you hope would be discussed today.
A topic that we hope to be discussed today.
Yes. Okay. We ready to go? Okay, now that you're set with your things, I wanted to go over the books that I selected for the class. We're going to be referencing them today, but I wanted you to know what you're getting yourself into if you should choose to take the class. This book, Adult Development, they're all used, by the way, so they look a little shabby, but that's probably a good thing. They're well worn. This Adult Development by Nemiroff and Colaroso. These are two psychoanalysts who got very interested in psychodynamic therapy for adults. They wanted to get a theory of adult development separate from child development. And this book is the compilation of research that they did, studies that they did, literature that they had found. It's a wonderful book. We could do a whole course just on this book because it talks about all the concepts that are prevalent in this midlife cycle. We are not using this book. We are using this book.
So
I wanted
what's
to.
the name and author?
This is adult. It's all on your in your packet. The syllabus is the last 3 sheets of the packet, and all the texts are listed in that.
Thank you.
This is the book we are using. It's their second book. They condensed all the material in this book in the first 2 chapters in this book. This is apropos. The Race Against Time. And what the reason that I liked this book was because after they did the condensation of all this theoretical material, they added clinical cases. And there's a chapter for a process of psychoanalysis throughout 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I thought for our purposes it would be more stimulating to have the clinical work as opposed to the theory. But the good thing is you're getting the theory today, because the first 2 chapters of this book are week 1, basically, of the 10-week course. So that's what I have outlined today. But we have this. I found it interesting. I hope you do. Another book is Aging in the 21st Century. This is more of a sociological book, and it has some very good articles on different aspects of aging and what we have to face as we go through life in the 21st century. And there are little snippets of these other books that are assigned. You can look at the syllabus and see exactly what I was referencing. This book, In Midlife, is based on Jungian psychotherapy, and Jung had a lot to say about mysticism and symbolic imagery, and his midlife focus is on transformation at this stage of life, and I liked this book. I'll read you a part of it later. And this book, Listening to Midlife, Turning Your Crisis into a Quest, is kind of a new agey book, and I liked the way it sounded, and I thought some of the chapters would fit in. So we kind of have a potpourri of readings, from the analytic to the sociological to the Jungian, the symbolic, the mystical, and something for everyone in this book. Okay? The first 2 chapters in this book are what we're going to be discussing today, and the beginning piece of it is all about the history. And I thought, oh, this is like dry. I thought, how can we get this a little meatier, but I thought it's important to go through the basic history so that you know the foundation of where they're coming from in their research. So I'm going to take you through a synopsis of what they said about the history of adult development, the pioneers in adult development, which would be Freud and Jung and Erikson, and then the hypotheses that they propose for their own research. And then we'll do a little exercise and take a break. And after the break, we'll get to more of the meatier stuff, which are all the issues that come up at this stage of life. Sexuality, gender differences, losses, changes in relationships, work situations, health, body. They're all, you can imagine having a chapter on each of those in this book, but we're going to touch on them today so that you get a little bit. I also have a clinical example that I thought was pertinent. It came from this book. I hope we have time to break into small groups and do it. I'm just going to watch the clock and see what we get up to. And then, so the clinical part will be after the break, okay? Also, I should tell you that the really fun part of the classes that we have here are based on the group interaction that we have. There's always a lot of lively discussion. So I welcome interruptions, I welcome questions. If anything strikes you, anything, that's the nice part about analytic work, you can say anything. Feel free, because I know we have a larger group and we're kind of crowded here, but actually that's cozy. So we can talk together if something comes to you, okay? I am following your outline now. So the basic themes, they put together basic themes about a life cycle, the life course, that are actually drawn from ancient civilizations. Through the years, there has always been a fascination with how man walks through the life cycle. So they chronicled them first as basic themes, and actually they come back to these themes when they're setting up their hypotheses, but we'll do that later. So just take a peek at them. I also told my husband that this is our PowerPoint presentation on paper. So this is our aging way of doing things, and maybe next time we will have PowerPoint up. The young people have all the technological things. I think we're doing great. This is my husband, Stan Sternberg, and he's responsible for the shift in all this computer things. I told him it's nice to marry a computer person. So we'll make use of it here.
And you fired all your kids.
Okay, what is the life course? These are the basic themes. A chronological life cycle can be described. Throughout history, there have always been stages of life that they have talked about. Adulthood is not static. The adult is in a constant state of dynamic change. And it fits in with the third one, which is development in adulthood is contiguous with that in childhood and old age, meaning that there are stages that we go through. I thought about Cinderella. She meets her prince, and they go off and they live happily ever after, but nobody tells you what happily ever after is. And a lot of the research and studies that have been done previously were done on child development, which when we get to Freud we'll look at that, and old age. But that whole middle place, let's say 40 to 80, has not been researched, or at least it hadn't been up until this point. These studies are more from the 80s, so and on upwards, so they cover what I would call contemporary, but I know that there's more research going on now. There is a continual need to define the adult self, the integrity of the inner person versus the outer environment. And you can think of the process toward enlightenment. Through the ages there has been an effort through religions, through mythology, through readings, to develop oneself, kind of go through cycles and get to a higher plane before you die, and maybe after you die. We don't know. Adults must come to terms with the limited lifespan. That is something that distinguishes adults from children, and we'll get into that more later. We have a very different perspective about time. Also the body. Number 6, the development and maintenance of the adult body and its relationship to the mind is a universal preoccupation. In childhood, we know that infants are preoccupied with their bodies, but they don't have the cognition that we have. And we look at our bodies and the need to take care of them from a totally different perspective. And finally, narcissism, which is a love of self, versus responsibility to the society in which one lives, is a central issue in all civilized cultures. Any questions about that? Anything to add? Anything strikes you? Sounds familiar? Good. I told you it was a little dry, but we're getting there. Actually, scientific research had not been started until the 1900s. So this is all part of the culture that we're talking about up until this point. But in the 1900s, and I was thinking, why in the 1900s? And the thought crossed my mind that we're getting older, that the age span is getting longer, so there was more of an interest in aging and what it does. If people didn't live past 40 or 50, then they didn't have this perspective on what are they doing with the rest of their time. And the first person that they referenced, I didn't know his name, but I certainly knew what he was talking about. Von Gennep, did any of you know that name? He wrote Rites of Passage, which we all know Rites de Passage. It was in 1908, and he said, "The life of an individual in any society is a series of passages from one age to another. A man's life comes to be made up of a succession of stages with similar ends and beginnings. For every one of these events there are ceremonies whose essential purpose is to enable the individual to pass from one defined position to another, which is equally well defined." Sound familiar? All cultures have this. He studied cultures, but he did it from a scientific perspective to understand the meaning of these rites of passage, to get someone to the next stage of development. But he was still focused on the outer environment. And it took Freud in the early 1900s. I mean, I don't even know what to say about Freud. I will say a few things, but we've just finished 2 classes on Freud here. Freud was a genius. He's the father of psychoanalysis. He changed our thinking about our inner worlds forever. The concepts that he researched are now part of our language. He was the first to study the interaction between the internal, biological, psychological self with the external environment. So he gave us the notion of the id, ego, and superego, which everybody has heard about. Those id impulses that churn somewhere internally within us, and the ego, which tries to modulate and be a cognitive, rational self, and the superego, which are basically our internalized parental messages, and they can either shame us and punish us and rid us with guilt, or they can give us that sense of a conscience that we're doing good in the world and we're okay, we can be proud of ourselves. Those concepts familiar to you? He also gave us levels of awareness: the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious self. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. And probably for our purposes today, most importantly, he gave us psychosexual stages. And you have a copy of them in your handout. I printed 2 of them off for you. Freud's stages of psychosexual development. Each one said something a little bit different. But I know you've all seen these before, but if you notice, it stops at the genital stage, which is from puberty on. It's supposed to be this concept that you have reached mature sexuality and you're ready to go forward in the world. Okay? What I found very interesting was a quote that Freud wrote about analysis with older patients. Let me read this to you. "The age of patients has much importance in determining their fitness for psychoanalytic treatment. That on the one hand, near or above the age of 50, the elasticity of the mental processes on which the treatment depends is as a rule lacking. Old people are no longer educable, and on the other hand, the mass of material to be dealt with would prolong the duration of the treatment indefinitely." I mean,
How old was he when he wrote that?
well, that was the irony of this, because he wrote this as he was nearing his own 50th birthday and was entering a particularly creative and productive period in his own life. So I thought maybe he was the first one to have this stereotype that you can't work with the elderly, or aging people. I can't even call it elderly. But I just found it fascinating that statement would even have been attributed to him. And then 15 years later, Carl Abraham wrote, "In my psychoanalytic practice, I have treated a number of chronic neuroses in persons of over 40 and even 50 years of age. You get a totally different perspective as you age. At first, it was only after some hesitation that I undertook cases of this kind, but I was more than once urged to make the attempt by patients themselves who had been treated unsuccessfully elsewhere. And I was, moreover, confident that if I could not cure the patients, I could at least give them a deeper and better understanding of their trouble. To my surprise, they reacted favorably to treatment, and I found some of these cures to be among my most successful." There is hope for us. Now, I think that probably the course of psychoanalysis has changed. That it used to be that you entered into psychoanalytic treatment 4 or 5 times a week, intensively. Your world was engulfed in this process. Could you imagine being on the couch 4 or 5 times a week?
I pay for it.
And then you were, after a number of years, you were supposedly cured of whatever neurosis it was. And these stages of fixation would have gone back to his stages of psychosexual development that you had to then free up and work through and get to this mature sexuality. But I think over the years, our process of therapy has changed drastically. That even a treatment of psychoanalytic work can be done once or twice a week for an indefinite period of time, and that more often people come as they need or have the desire to work through certain issues in their mind, and the therapist helps with that. It's not unusual to have people come into treatment, stay for a while can be a few weeks, a few months, a few years, stop for a while, God bless you, and come back. It's almost like you have a relationship with a therapist for as long as you want it to be there. And I don't think it was like that. Although, for all I know, there were situations like that in the early 1900s when this was written. But I don't think it was the norm. Do you have any comments about that? Or you think, yeah?
Well, when Freud was seeing people 4, 5, 6 times a week, the sessions last a year or 2. Where over time it began to extend depending on the severity of the condition he was treating. Because he had some very sick patients that he saw, and then he saw patients that weren't so well. So it would depend on that, but mostly 2 years. And 5 times a week sounds like a lot, but he dealt with the wealthy, he had a lot of money, and they could afford the time, energy, and effort to do that. It's only over the years that the time has changed based on needs of patients, and the type of conditions have changed. Because again, back then, his patients were generally sicker and less neurotic, but they were all considered neurotic at the time by definition. But, so there was a change, there was a shift, and it was based on need.
Okay, we're leaving Freud. Going on to Carl Jung. He focused actually much more on the midlife years, and I wanted to reach, and he had also a mystical approach. Now, I am not a Jungian. Bob would be better at giving us background on Jung, but he worked a lot with Greek mythology, and he saw repetitions and the notion of archetypes, which I think is a familiar phrase for most of you. It's like an internalized image that we have of something primal and ancient, like the archetypal mother or the archetypal father or parent. And he has archetypal guides, internal mythological guides to help us through different stages and transformations as we go through adult life. He also said that he looked at the 20s and 30s as still times when we were separating from our parents, and then the 40s, 50s, some shift occurred. And I just wanted to read you a couple of lines from the introduction here. The reason this happens at midlife calls for some attention. A shibboleth that circulates throughout the whole field of psychotherapy holds that the fault of adulthood's psychological turmoil should all be laid at the feet of defective childhood. If only childhood were good enough, adulthood would be tranquil. If this old psychoanalytic model of development were indeed true, nothing would remain to do therapeutically or developmentally after age 5 but to undo the wrongs that had been done earlier. Recent research has, if nothing else, exploded this fiction and has shown that adulthood is as developmental as childhood or adolescence is. At midlife, there is a crossing over from one psychological identity to another. The self goes through a transformation. I consider midlife to be a time when persons are going through a fundamental shift in their alignment with life and with the world, and this shift has psychological and religious meaning beyond the interpersonal and social dimensions. Midlife is a crisis of the spirit, and in this crisis, old selves are lost and new ones come into being. There is a loss, but there is also something to go forward to again. Yes, you thinking? Okay. Okay, and finally for today, we have Erikson, who certainly was a pioneer. He was the first person to give us a psychosocial view of the stages of life, and you have his stages of life as your handout also. It's right on the back of Freud's sheet. It's a little small, but it was the best summary I could find, and when I tried to make it larger, I lost half the page. So this is what we have. And we are most interested in stages 7 and 8, generativity versus stagnation, and also integrity versus despair at the end of life. He also saw development not so much as a stability in each stage, but as changes necessary to transcend these successive contradictions and conflicts within each stage and move on to the next stage. And how you resolve those conflicts determines how your sense of well-being, how satisfied life feels to you. Okay, these were the pioneers. Any questions? Good. The 1970s were moving along. These were the pioneer adult developmental researchers, scientists. And in the 1970s, there was a proliferation of research coming out of Harvard, Yale, UCLA on adult development. And they were interested in normal as opposed to pathological adult development. What do adults go through at different stages of their lives, and what meaning does this have for them? And there were longitudinal studies, there were surveys, there were all kinds of research projects that were summarized in this book and in this book. And the highlights of the results of that research was that there are stable and transitional periods throughout adulthood. There's a flow. There is a more mature use of defense mechanisms, and I also gave you a listing of the defense mechanisms on the next page. And adults who have developed or evolved within themselves tend to use more mature defense mechanisms, which we can get into. And there is a recognition of internal conflict within each stage. But what I found most interesting, I just picked up things that I wanted to kind of share with you about this, is that there are 4 assumptions made by children that project the illusion of absolute safety, and that these need to be challenged and mastered to attain emotional security. And I wrote these down because they're going to resonate with you also, and if anyone wants to comment on them, I would welcome that. These illusions are: 1, we will always live with our parents and be their child. 2, they will always be there to help when we can't do something on our own. 3, their simplified version of our complicated inner reality is correct, as when they turn on the lights in our bedroom to prove there are no ghosts or monsters under the bed. I added that because I thought there were monsters under the bed. And 4, there is no real death or evil in the world.
Oh shoot, those are illusions?
And that's the way children feel.
Could you read number 3 again?
Sure. Their simplified version of our complicated inner reality is correct. As when they turn on this is about parents.
Oh, yeah.
As when they turn on the lights in our bedroom to prove there are no ghosts or monsters under the bed. I thought I had this down for you in the, let me see. Is this on somewhere? Do I have them? No, I didn't write that down for you. Sorry, they're in my
That's
notes,
good
not
stuff.
yours. We can print this out. But I got a kick out of that because it felt so real. This was true. We all have felt that. We can relate to it. And part of maturing is the loss of these illusions. And we fight them. It's a narcissistic injury to lose those illusions. And we will talk about narcissistic injuries as we go along.
So like the death of a parent would wipe a lot of this out.
Totally. It's how reality hits you. And usually the working through, we're going to talk about mourning and liberation as we go along, but it's the change in reality that hits you that you can't deny, and how that's incorporated into your psychic structure to move on to another place.
So I can turn off the lights now.
No monsters coming out, huh? Okay, and what Nemiroff and Colarusso did then was set up hypotheses that they were going to study and research. And I want to give you the hypotheses now, and then we're going to do a little exercise. These hypotheses do relate to the initial basic themes that we talked about. They're a little bit different. They're a little more therapeutic. So I wanted to kind of summarize them for you. Well, you have them here. Basic theoretical hypotheses on the first page. The nature of basically what they're saying is that there is a developmental process that is ongoing in adulthood. They're challenging the notion that we are fixed entities after the age of 6, or if we get through genital stages with Freud, after puberty, and that development is ongoing. And I have to say, I am also guilty of this. I tend to like attachment theory, and I've talked to clients about an internal working model, and I'll go back to telling them that, you know, the patterns that you internalize from how your parents treated you and when you're in your early years tend to be the patterns that you have inside, that you tend to treat yourself that way, or you treat other people that way, or you expect others to treat you that way. And I was thinking, wait a minute. You know, I automatically go back to that point in time when I think about it, but they're not discounting that as much as they're adding to it. They're saying that these structures are in place, but that as we go through adult development, we add to them. It's not fixed at that point in time. That's actually why we would say that therapy has a beneficial effect. If we're not changing those early internal patterns, what are we doing in therapy? So that was my basic message. There are some points here that I just want to highlight because they have research on them. The nature of the developmental process is basically the same in the adult as in the child, and by that they mean we continue to interact with our internal world, our psychological world, and the environment, and keep growing. Development during the adult years is an ongoing dynamic process as opposed to genetic, which is what we're saying. It's as opposed to a fixed entity that is within us. This part I found interesting. To distinguish between child and adult development, child development is focused on the formation of a psychic structure, whereas adult development is concerned with the continuing evolution of the existing psychic structure and with its use. And they gave an example in this book about love and the difference between infatuation and mature love. And I could sort of envision it, so I wanted to share it with you. They talked about that feeling of infatuation. Now, our first infatuation is during the Oedipal phase. Daddy and mommy are our first love. Probably mommy is our first love, but one of those. And in puberty, that sense of infatuation, a consuming feeling, a high of just being attracted to this person and needing them. I mean, we've all seen teenagers who were very scared for, because they're so impulsive that if they have a breakup, we think that, you know, they think the world is going to end. But that infatuation, when it develops in puberty, adolescence, forms a psychic structure. It's like you can feel it. You have a familiar connection with something that is now part of you, that's inside of you. And mature love builds upon that. Mature love builds with security, with commitment, with an acceptance, with an appreciation, which is very different from infatuation. But the two interweave with each other. Infatuation that doesn't end with mature love can be very unsettling, depressing. You're left just with this feeling within yourself. And mature love that misses out on infatuation can deaden and lose its excitement. So there has to be some type of a blend, but we build on those structures as we go forward in life. Any questions about that? Comments? We're good. Okay. Yes.
Quick. You don't even have to answer it now, maybe in the course. But I was also thinking that infatuation seems to be, can you hear me?
Yes.
Infatuation seems to be a period when you think you're in love with somebody else, but you're really thinking about yourself. Mature love is the other direction.
That's a very good point. Did everybody hear that? Mature love is about caring for the other person and their well-being in a very different way than infatuation. You need that for yourself. Number 5, developmental processes in adults are influenced by the adult past as well as childhood. That's what we're saying. And number 6 is something that we're going to get into more. There is these are all their hypotheses, by the way. I'm just reiterating that. That this is what they studied, that there is a profound interaction between the body and physical changes and psychological expression in adulthood. And number 7, the paramount issue affecting the developmental process in the second half of life is the growing awareness of death and the finiteness of time. This is a central phase-specific theme of adult development, and it's a normative crisis precipitated by this awareness. This conflict is universal, containing within it the possibility of developmental progression or regression and arrest. This is something that children don't have. They don't have a time sense the way we have. And often, if the pet dies, they want the pet to come back. That sense of death is not the same in childhood as it is in adulthood. So these are the hypotheses that they were studying, and some concepts came out of that. But following on this, I want to do a little something with you. So bear with me. We're going to take a journey. Get comfortable. Sit back. Close your eyes. This is going to be like a guided imagery. Take a deep breath. Relax into yourself. This is the New Agey stuff I'm adding. It's not psychoanalytic. Okay. As your body is relaxing, take a few deep breaths. And imagine you are looking into a mirror and see a reflection of yourself as you are today. Study your features. Follow the outlines of your face. Pay attention to your body. What are you aware of? What thoughts are crossing your mind as you look at yourself? What are your feelings about yourself as you take one last look in this mirror? Now imagine that the mirror is clouding over as if the steam from a hot shower is blurring the image. Take a moment to sit with this fog all around you. Take a moment to just breathe. Now, gradually, the fog is lifting and fresh air is coming into the room. The image of you is clearing up, but it is 5 years from now in time. You are 5 years older than you are today. What do you look like to yourself? What thoughts are crossing your mind as you gaze at your image? What concerns do you have for yourself? What feelings are you aware of? Take a moment to sit with this older you, this you of the future. Now, gradually and at your own pace, you may bring your awareness back to this room and remember that the future never really comes. You are always in today. How do you want to be with yourself? This is the point that I also thought we would take maybe 4 minutes if anybody has to go to the bathroom. But I also was thinking that in this period of time, if you wanted to share any of your reactions with a partner, you can find someone who looks safe to talk to as you and take a couple of minute break. And that's why we have name tags also. I didn't want to go around with everybody introducing themselves. Take a break and we'll come back and get on to the concepts that have emerged.
Stacked on top of each other on each floor.
3 bathrooms. One here, one upstairs, one downstairs.
And there are donuts and coffee
Yes.
and healthy stuff.
Pass over front.
Ian, you still there?
I'll have one afterwards.
Okay, we're taking a break, so I guess we can just keep on, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I have a feeling I'm not going to get to everything.
It's a nice little camera.
Say again?
I thought you always